Our 2024 New York Giants opponent preview series winds down this week, and today we're looking at the Indianapolis Colts with Locked On Colts co-host Jake Arthur. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. The playoffs might be in the books and sports might stop sporting the way we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for Giants on SI. You can find my written work at si.com/NFL/Giants. And welcome on into my Blue Crew community members, my everydayers, and everybody in between. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, we are continuing our look at the New York Giants 2024 regular season opponents. And we're going back to the AFC, a team that we see once every 4 years. So a lot of changes since the last time we saw this team. But we're going to take a look at the Indianapolis Colts. And here to help me break down the Colts is Jake Arthur, one half of the dynamic duo over at Locked On Colts. Jake, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, always. All right, Jake, I think we have to start with the obvious question. The quarterback.
Yeah.
Anthony Richardson is coming off of an injury. I know he has done some work he did some work, I should say, in the spring. How has he looked, and are there any concerns about whether he's going to be ready to start the season?
No, from the team perspective, I don't think they have any concerns. I think they just want to get this guy on the field, and like everybody else, it's kind of a, let's hopefully get this 16, 17 games under his belt, and then we don't have to really worry about the injury labels anymore. He was like a month or so ahead of schedule in terms of throwing. He started in February. Now, obviously with a shoulder, that's like a pretty strenuous recovery. But he was there from day one in the offseason program. We got to watch, I think, 4 practices featuring him throwing. He missed the last 1.5. They held him out from throwing on the final day of mandatory minicamp, just because he was experiencing some soreness, which is to be expected. A lot of people kind of threw up the panic flag on that one, but he's supposed to be having soreness still. He even said himself, he's like, we're surprised. This is the first day they've had to hold me back. So he's, as far as everyone knows, he's fine, recovering nicely. Again, like I said, ahead of schedule. He's supposed to be getting some throwing sessions in and everything with his skill position guys during this break until training camp starts. So I think everyone is just kind of waiting with bated breath. I don't want to sound naive, like there aren't concerns about the injuries, because, I mean, he only played 4 games last year. But I think everybody is kind of on this side is on the same boat, where it's just like, let's get a full season under this guy's belt, and then we don't really have to wait for the other shoe to drop, hopefully.
Before he went down with that injury, Jake, where was he in his development? Because I would imagine losing as many games as he did may have set him back. I mean, what is the concern there with him as far as, this year coming up?
So I think everyone was pleasantly surprised with his development and where he was at that stage, because coming into the league, he was drafted as obviously an incredibly athletic, high potential guy, but super, super raw, because he only had a dozen games in college. But he was a little ahead of the curve, in terms of where he was expected to be. Something that did show up on his film at Florida was his ability to use his eyes to manipulate defenders into his throwing windows or move them out of the way. So in that regard, he was further along than a lot of people anticipated. Now, he does have a lot to work on. There are some issues with, the consistency of his accuracy and things like that. But the guy is like addicted to his craft and getting better. So he's at least got the right mental makeup that you hope to see in a guy that does need work. But in terms of where he is as a passer, he's playable in the NFL. Like he earned the starting job outright for good reason. I don't think he was as raw and unready, I guess you could say, as a lot of people thought he was going to be. But this is a guy that just needs game experience. Like as he keeps going, we're just not going to know until he gets a bunch of games under his belt. So far, I mean, everything is optimistic that they did draft the right guy and that he looks good. But I mean, he has this injury label to shake now. And, as he does get more playing time under his belt, he's already shown great development, but he needs to keep showing that in order to, take the next leap into being considered more than just a super athletic quarterback.
All right, let's now talk about his supporting cast because that's important. It looks like from the outside looking in, there might be some question marks around the receivers. You got Michael Pittman back, but after that, it's kind of it seems like a toss-up. What is the status there?
Yeah, so they've got some quality players, but I think we're kind of waiting to see how it all works together. Michael Pittman is no mystery. That's a 100-catch guy. Catches pretty much everything. He can do that dirty work over the middle. Is a little better downfield than given credit for, but he's really only had one season where he's been looked at downfield, and that was with Carson Wentz when he was locked onto him constantly. So he's he's good. You got your top receiver there. Where it goes beyond that is, I think a lot of people like Josh Downs as the slot receiver. He had a really productive rookie season for the Colts. Was essentially one of their most productive rookie receivers in franchise history. So you like what you got there, but then you look at the other outside receiver spot and Alec Pierce versus the rookie Adonai Mitchell. So Mitchell, of course, high ceiling, fell to the second round there in the 50s. There were concerns about, he had this stuff with like diabetes and how he managed it and like how it affected his mood and stuff like that. But the Colts seem absolutely smitten with what they've got there with him. And, they like Alec Pierce more than he's been able to show. You would like to see him be able to do more. But in his role as like a downfield specialist, he is quite good. But Gardner Minshew just didn't really pull the trigger on that last year. The Colts haven't really had a downfield passer at quarterback since they've had Alec Pierce. But he's also a very good blocker as well. So that means he almost never leaves the field. So I think really the dynamic is how do all these guys mesh on the field together? The two most consistent, permanent pieces, I think, are Pittman and Downs. You know exactly what they are, but you're going to have to find that balance between how much do you play Mitchell and Pierce, because I do think they're both going to have really specialized roles. Mitchell, though, had a great offseason program with the Colts, rookie camp, OTAs, and mandatory minicamp. Richardson looked his way a lot downfield, and Mitchell, I think he had the best catch percentage in the draft class among all rookie receivers, or he was near the top, and that showed because that guy is able to make some really difficult contested catches.
What about Jonathan Taylor? I know he had, I think, the hand injury or the thumb injury last year. I'm assuming that's not an issue now?
No, he was out there pretty much the whole time. He had an excused absence at one point during, I think it was the mandatory or the OTA session. But he had been out there healthy throughout the offseason program. He came into last year with the ankle, which ankle/contract negotiation, and then kind of in the latter part of the season, he had the issue with the thumb that caused him to miss some time. But as far as we know, Taylor is 100% healthy. He's a guy as a running back where they don't want to give him too much wear and tear during stuff like practice. So to see him out there practicing as much as possible was definitely encouraging, because I think Taylor and Richardson only got like 4 snaps together during the regular season before Richardson went out for his season-ending injury. So they really want to get that chemistry between those guys as tight as possible. And so far, so good.
All right, coming up next, we're going to talk about what I think is a big question mark for the Indianapolis Colts offense. We're talking with Jake Arthur of Locked On Colts. Giant fans, don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans. Major League Baseball and the WNBA are in full swing right now. And before you know it, the NHL, the NBA, and NFL seasons will be here as well. But here's the good news. While we wait for those leagues to start up, FanDuel is here year round with opportunities to dream up bets anytime on anything in the sports world. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head on over to fanduel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are looking at the New York Giants 2024 opponents. Today, we are taking a look at the Indianapolis Colts, and Jake Arthur, co-host of Locked On Colts, is here to break everything down. And Jake, let's talk about what I think, from the outside looking in, is probably one of the biggest question marks on the Colts offense, and that would be the offensive line. Where does that unit currently stand?
Yeah, so right now, all is well on the offensive line front. From a Giants perspective, last time you guys saw it was 2022 when it was all bad. We tried to Nick Foles out there. It was not a pretty performance. But luckily, kind of ever since then, in that super chaotic 2022 season, some of the sweeping changes that have come through the Colts facility included the offensive line kind of getting its act together again, because it's mostly the same personnel. Quentin Nelson, Ryan Kelly, Braden Smith are all still there. Now, Bernhard Raimann is going into year 3. He's becoming a really nice left tackle. Will Fries is probably if you had to point out a weak link, that's probably it, because he's not Quentin Nelson, obviously. But he still plays average football, which is more than adequate for the whole unit to function normally. So, they're not giving up a ton of sacks. We just saw, the last game was Jonathan Taylor running for like 170 on the Texans. So this offensive line now, they strung together a whole quality season in 2023. So they really resemble a lot closer to the 2018, 19, 20 teams than they do the 2022 season. That was one that just everyone wanted to kind of flush away and move along from it. The biggest question mark with the offensive line, though, is health. I think the normal starting 5 only started like 5 games together last year. There's just a lot of injuries. Braden Smith, he dealt with a lot of stuff. He had a knee cleanup this offseason to kind of help that. Quentin Nelson was, Mr. Reliable. Bernhard Raimann missed a couple games. Ryan Kelly did. But really health is the only factor. But somehow, even with kind of a revolving door on the offensive line last year, they were successful.
All right. So that all being said, Jake, what is the one question that you would like to see the Colts answer on the offensive side of the ball?
I think the biggest question is just there's so much that we don't know until we know that Anthony Richardson is going to be there, be healthy, and carry this offense for the entire season, because things are just so much different. Joe Flacco and Anthony Richardson are quite different in terms of how they play. You've got a guy like Richardson who you could probably bank on at least, several hundred rushing yards and perhaps even like 8 or so touchdowns. He was certainly on a pace like that last year. And then Joe Flacco, we saw with the Browns, very successful, got the most out of that offense, but just kind of a grip it and rip it gunslinger. He threw a lot of interceptions, but he was very productive in terms of touchdowns and yardage. So the biggest question is just what's the offense going to look like? And that all rides on Anthony Richardson's presence.
All right, let's flip over to the defensive side of the ball. And I guess we should start with Grover Stewart. And if I remember correctly, he was suspended, I think it was last year. What's the status with him, and how much of a difference is his return going to make for that defensive front?
Yeah, no, him being back is huge. He missed 6 games with a PED suspension, and I get the feeling it was just, something that wasn't looked into enough, a substance or whatever. Like, no one seemed to be, disappointed in his actions with that. So I think it's just something we see all the time where guys just didn't look closely enough at what they're taking. But in his absence, it was huge last year. The Colts gave up an average of over 150 yards per game on the ground without him for those 6 games. And then with him back, it was like a switch flipped. It was in the other 11 games, I think it was only like 105 to 110. So quite a huge difference. Now, the biggest thing now is the Colts do have some depth with Stewart out. They had to rely on Taven Bryan to kind of play nose, which is so far not in his wheelhouse. He's kind of a classic rotational 3-tech, and so the Colts really weren't prepared to be without a guy like Grover Stewart or DeForest Buckner. And one of the very few exterior moves they made this offseason was getting Raekwon Davis from the Dolphins. Not a big statistical guy, but a space eater. Just someone reliable who can kind of occupy blocks is exactly what they need. Just someone who's not going to be pushed around like what they dealt with last year.
So in looking at this Colts defense, where is the strength and where is the biggest concern?
So the biggest strength on that defense is definitely the line. They had 51 sacks last year. There's a top 5 group. Actually broke the Indianapolis era franchise record for sacks in a season. And now they added Laiatu Latu. So that's really big for them. Kwity Paye, you got to count on him developing even further. Dio Adangbo. So they were a productive group, but they're still pretty young with some guys who are getting even better. And of course, like I mentioned, adding Latu on top of that is huge. I mean, the on tape, the best pure pass rusher from the draft, but there's obviously that question mark with his neck. The Colts have not been ones to invest in draft picks with serious injuries that they feel will cause them issues down the line early in the draft. So for him to get a clean bill of health from them, I think is big. But the biggest question mark is definitely in the secondary. So it's good that they have a good defensive front because, way back there, they've got a lot of youth. They did invest heavily in corners last draft. They drafted 3. 2 are still with the team, Juju Brents and Jalen Jones. Jones, a 7th rounder, played pretty much every week last year. He had to be a full-time starter by midseason. He outperformed what you would expect a 7th rounder to do, but at the same time, it's like he was pretty good, but you weren't that wasn't your intention. You're still probably looking for a little more. They at least have stood pat and said that they really like their cornerbacks. Like, they acknowledge they're young and they had some issues last year with injuries and not really, when you're that young in the secondary, you can't afford to have so many injuries. And this is kind of the perfect storm last year. But the safety group is one where that's really unsettled. They did re-sign Julian Blackman, who is a pretty good starting safety, but has never played a full season so far. And then at free safety, it's like, who do we got? You had Rodney Thomas, who had a pretty solid rookie season, but in year 2, kind of took a little bit of a step back and was benched at the end of the year. And then you've got Nick Cross, who was also going into his 2nd year last year. He's a 3rd-round pick that they traded up for in that draft, but has never quite earned the trust to be a full-time starter yet. And it looks like he's got the inside track, but the secondary is definitely the biggest question mark there, which, like I mentioned, at least if that's going to be the case, you really like your defensive front at least.
All right, we're talking with Jake Arthur, co-host of Locked On Colts, who's breaking down the Indianapolis Colts, kind of giving us a little early overview before training camp. When we come back, we're going to talk about some more of the new faces on the Colts and some of the storylines or players that maybe aren't being discussed enough, but probably should be. So don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So go on and keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, eBay's Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, everybody, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are looking at the New York Giants 2024 regular season opponents. The Indianapolis Colts are on the schedule. Once every 4 years, we get to see the Colts, and a lot has changed. Obviously, some new faces and whatnot. And Jake, let's talk about some of the new faces. I know you've been mentioning a few as we've gone along, but who are some of the other new faces, be it draft picks, be it, free agents that the Colts have picked up that you think are going to play really big roles in this team this year?
Yeah, so you kind of have to look at the draft class because the only exterior guys they signed were Joe Flacco and Raekwon Davis. And I mean, Davis is a backup, nose tackle, and then Flacco, you hope to never see him because, he's your backup quarterback. So you got to look at that draft class. Latu, he was drafted 15th overall, the first defensive player in the draft, but I don't know that he will be a starter immediately. But with that said, I think he'll still have a pretty significant role throughout the season. He was a solid run defender in college, but I think they might just kind of start him out a little slower, maybe like a designated pass rusher role, just to kind of get him going. And then you look at A.D. Mitchell. That's a guy who I kind of mentioned. You don't know what that role is yet because you have Alec Pierce, who is a guy who you really never took off the field, but he's just made so many plays from what we've seen, and that doesn't even include the practices that the media didn't get to see. So when you have a young, exciting rookie who is doing things in practice that matched the really exciting stuff he was doing on college film, I really don't know how long you could keep a guy like that out. Otherwise, if you're going for someone who's maybe a little under the radar in terms of new faces, linebacker Jalen Carlies, the guy they picked on day 3 of the draft. The Colts didn't really have a solid passing down linebacker. I mean, Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed are great run defenders. And I mean, they're technically 3-down linebackers. Like it's fine to have them out there, but losing Bobby Okereke was terrible. I mean, you guys saw that. That guy is an absolute stud. And the Colts, it's kind of a big what if now because the Colts couldn't pay Okereke because what they were paying Shaquille Leonard, and now Leonard's not even there anymore. So it's kind of it stinks from a Colts perspective. But they really needed to fill that void in terms of pass coverage. And Carlies was a college safety at Mizzou, who I think they have visions of him being that kind of Bobby Okereke type player. I mean, maybe not with that significant of a role because, again, I don't know how many snaps they have for a third linebacker. You don't really have 3 linebackers on the field very often anymore. But that's a guy who I think has a very niche role that is important. And he's huge. He's not just big for like a safety. He's like 6'3", 220 or something. Like, he's a big kid. So I definitely think he brings something to the table. And then after that, I mean, you hope no injuries, but they did draft a couple of offensive linemen in the mid-rounds, traded up in round 3 for Matt Gonsalves, and then round 4, Tanner Bortolini. Now, long-term, I think you're looking at these guys more in a bigger role next year because, like I mentioned earlier, offensive line, you've got a lot of free agents coming up. Pretty much the entire interior of your line, except for Quentin Nelson, is going to be coming up on free agency next year. But injuries happen, especially with the Colts, of course. So those guys you project them really well down the line, but I think they're probably just realistically going to have some sort of role just because injuries do exist this year.
You mentioned Bobby Okereke and what a loss that was.
Mm-hmm.
How has the defense changed in trying to compensate for Okereke's departure?
Well, I don't think we really know yet until about week 1 because they had to try and get Shaquille Leonard work back in there. And eventually they were just like, man, this isn't going to work. We need to get EJ Speed in there because he's more effective. And so Leonard was waived, and then EJ Speed became that starting will linebacker. But they've kind of replaced Okereke, piecemeal, I guess you could say. I mean, Franklin and Speed are going to see the vastly, bigger snap numbers than other guys. But, when they bring in a Carlisle or a Ronnie Harrison, who's another former safety turn linebacker, they'll kick Speed over to the Sam linebacker spot and then have those guys play the weak side so they could, have a little more freedom in the passing game. But so far they have not, I would say, successfully replaced Okereke because, again, that coverage linebacker was a need coming into this offseason. Not huge because Speed and Franklin are really productive. But you need someone in the middle of the field that is going to be able to do a little more in the passing game.
By the way, we are loving Okereke here in New York.
I'm sure.
Absolutely loving him.
Yeah.
Good player, good dude, smart.
Oh yeah.
I mean, what a pickup by the Giants. Not to rub it in your face, mind you, but he's been a great addition. All right, Jake. Some of the storylines that maybe are a bigger deal in Indianapolis that aren't really being discussed outside of Indianapolis, but should be. What are some of those?
Well, obviously, I think everyone nationally knows that the secondary is probably that biggest iffy thing. But not to sound too much like a homer, but their tight end group has a ton of potential. They just had injuries all last year. The Colts are kind of known for being one of these teams that goes out and drafts uber athletes. When you look at their relative athletic scores, they all have like 9s or higher out of 10. So 2 years ago, they drafted Jelani Woods out of Virginia, had the highest relative athletic score for a tight end ever coming into the draft. And he had some flashes as a rookie, but then was expected to take that next step and kind of be a stud last year, but just kind of had some unprecedented hamstring injuries that even he said, like, the specialists he saw were like, we've never really seen this before. That kept him out all year. So the Colts, I think a lot of people have forgotten about Jelani Woods. So he's kind of a big sleeper. Will Mallory's another young tight end that's kind of up and coming. Drew Ogletree, Kylan Granson, and Mo Alley Cox have been kind of the only constants out there. Cox is an older vet who may, if these younger guys step up, Cox may not even make the roster. But Granson has really been the only other consistent in the tight end room. And he may be capped on what he could do, which is fine. He's a pretty decent player that can kind of wear a lot of hats. But they do have at least one or two potential studs in this tight end room. And Jelani Woods in particular, he's like 6'7", 260, 270, super athletic again, former quarterback. That's a guy who is a huge mismatch nightmare if he stays healthy. So that is a player, at least in the fantasy community, people nationally might become a lot more familiar with him by the end of the season. All
right. Now, Jake, if I'm correct here, I don't think the Colts had any major coaching changes. Am I correct with that? The coordinators are all back?
Yeah, coordinators are all back. It was defensive line. They've got a new coach there, and then like assistant secondary. So nothing huge, but the defensive line hire is kind of a sneaky one. Charlie Partridge replaces Nate Ollie. Partridge is a guy who came from the college ranks, but he coached Trey Hendrickson, J.J. Watt, Trey Flowers. Like, he's got some big NFL caliber names on his resume. And again, like I mentioned, the Colts have some young, kind of untapped potential. Like they're getting productivity out of them, but like young athletic guys with still room to grow. So adding a guy like Partridge who has that track record, that's pretty interesting.
Well, the reason why I ask is because, it's the same systems on offense and defense. What are some wrinkles that you might be anticipating to be new this year on either side of the ball?
Offensively, I think obviously it could look drastically different, obviously, just because they had to change the offense pretty wholesale when Richardson went out. Gardner Minshew, I think a lot of people nationally probably had him in higher regard than those of us, locally. The Colts had the highest RPO percentage in the league last year because they had to account for Minshew needing to get the ball out like immediately. That's not a big progressions guy. He's not someone who really throws the ball downfield. And Richardson, I mean, he's going to be more aggressive downfield. He can run more. He's someone who actually, although he's mobile, he always did a really good job of avoiding sacks. In coming out of college, he was pretty raw, but he was one of the best quarterbacks in that draft class at avoiding pressure and kind of manipulating the pocket. So the offense could just look totally night and day because Pierce is now not your only vertical threat. You've got Pierce and A.D. Mitchell. Shane Steichen worked miracles with what he had last year, but, all the fingers crossed, knock on wood, everything. You might have a healthy quarterback in there who is really dynamic, can run the ball, but also take the top off of the defense. And when you have a quarterback in there, it's a nightmare for defenses because they can't account for everything. And so the Colts were rather productive given all those issues last year. I mean, they were the last team to score 20 points in like their first 9 or 10 games, despite having Gardner Minshew, who not terrible, but you just have a very low ceiling when that's, the quarterback play you're getting. So things could be drastically different, like an offense that might be unrecognizable compared to last year. Plus Jonathan Taylor healthy. I mean, we saw what he did in 2021. It was one of the best seasons Colts running backs ever had, and that includes Edgerrin James, Eric Dickerson, Marshall Faulk. Like, Taylor is a special player when he's healthy.
What about the defensive side? Are you anticipating anything major as far as wrinkles go?
I don't think so. I think they just need these young guys to grow up. I will say one thing I think we all hope is a big change is that so many breakdowns in coverage, just communication seemed to be off. A lot more deep plays were given up than what you would see in this Gus Bradley defense. So I think it was kind of all the same usual suspects from the safety group and then the younger corners just not being on the same page. So you've got to think just continuity between those guys and learning each other's tendencies and just getting that better communication. That's got to be the biggest change defensively because, like I've said a couple of times, that secondary is just the biggest toss-up.
All right, Giant fans, he is Jake Arthur, one half of Locked On Colts. Jake, I want to thank you for coming on, breaking down the Colts for us. I mean, the Giants don't see the Colts until later in the season, but always a good idea to get a little bit of an overview as to what the storylines are, who the players are, and just basically how this might unfold. So we appreciate you coming on. Giant fans, please check out all of our Locked On hosts. We've got all 32 NFL teams covered. We've got Major League Baseball covered, hockey, which I know just wrapped up. That's covered. The NBA, that is covered. We have college sports covered. So much is going on here year round. And also don't forget to check out our 24/7 stream on YouTube, Locked On Sports Today. For Jake Arthur, I'm Patricia Traina. We'll see you again soon, Giant fans.